Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, Intelligent Automation, Driving a New Level of Revenue Cycle Performance. I am Laura Deirdre with Becker's Healthcare. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We are looking forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. In about a week following the webinar, we will be sending all registrants a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. At this time, it is now my pleasure to start today's webinar by introducing our presenter. David Millen is the Vice President of Information Technology at R1 RCM. In his role, David is responsible for finding new ways to respond to evolving technology world and strategizing on the development of digital solutions for revenue cycle management, claims, medical coding services, and risk management. Prior to joining R1, David was the Vice President of Smarter Process at IBM, where he was responsible for driving the strategy and execution of the IBM business process and decision management portfolio. David also held software development roles at Lotus and Apple Computer. David has over 20 years of experience in IT strategy development, systems integration, and software development. David lives in Nashville with his wife and 3 children. He is a foosball enthusiast and enjoys outdoor activities. At this time, I am pleased to turn the floor over to David to begin today's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for the kind introduction there, and welcome to everybody that's able to be online today. I'm looking forward to the next 1 hour or so as we talk about intelligent automation, or RPA. So if folks are ready, I'd like to go ahead and get us started. So let me just touch a little bit about today's objectives. So you heard from the title of the chart that we're going to talk about hospital health systems and physician groups and why and how it's important for them to find new ways to adopt the way that they perform in the market itself. We're going to talk about one of the key opportunities that's been leveraged as part of that, which is robotic process automation and what it does well and how it goes about doing that. And then all of the things that we're going to learn during our conversation today is ways to drive, decreasing the cost and time that's associated with many of the heavyweight or optimal processes that make up, not only revenue cycle care, but also other health care space processes. There's opportunities here to not only improve things like collection rates, but also to do things like reduce errors in the system, but also make significant gains in the types of information that your organization can generate. So looking forward to having all of those elements in our discussion today. So before we get into the details of the RPA and automation topic itself, I think it's important to sort of set some context for how and what's going on in the healthcare space that may make automation such an important topic for us today. And I think there's a bit of a perfect storm that's been brewing there, and much has been written about this, much has been said about this. I'm sure in your own journeys you've found lots of things to read that would support some of these better known circumstances. And these perfect storm elements really focus on two kind of ends of a spectrum of a continuum that's complicating things. The first is the ever-increasing cost aspects of it, and the second end of that spectrum would be complexity. And so as I was going about preparing for today's conversation, one of the things I was doing is, trying to make sure that there was a context setting for where we could begin our conversation. And so some interesting data points that I found. First one was provided by U.S. Economy, and it is in 2017, the healthcare costs were above $3.5 trillion, which represented approximately 18% of our GDP. By comparison, just 47 years ago, our healthcare costs were in the neighborhood of $27.2 billion, which represented only 5% of our gross product. And so you can see that escalating cost is really notable and obvious there. When we think about the topic of complexity, this is really about the changes that are being brought to bear by technology in the healthcare space. And there's no expectation that this is going to slow down anytime soon. Whether we're talking about improving the interoperabilities of standards like, FHIR, or, leveraging technologies like blockchain for being able to perform distributed ledger functions that drive smarter contracting opportunities. Or whether we're talking about the fact that almost 80% of all the data that's used to drive our healthcare space, at least the digital data, was created in the last 7 years. Imagine that. And all of this technology is not expected to slow down in terms of velocity anytime soon. In fact, it's expected to continue to grow at 12% a year from an investment and opportunity standpoint. And then lastly, when you think about, the escalating costs and the complexity, there's no question that there's expense pressures. And you can see that from a Moody's Investor Service report, this was also published earlier this year, that the median annual expense rate is growing and outpacing or being outpaced by the actual expense itself in the entire healthcare industry space. So what is a healthcare system to do? What are physician groups to do, or other providers that work in this space? Well, one of the most notable ways that they're responding to this disruption is with the context of automation. And we're going to talk a lot about this today. But let's just talk about that for a second in the context of it's already been recognized that this is one lever that you may pull in order for you to better perform in the healthcare space. And so notable report here produced by Deloitte earlier this year, 53% of the respondents in their survey have already started their RPA journey. And this is expected to increase in the next 2 years to be 72%, almost 3/4 of the folks that are actually beginning their RPA journey would be in that time frame. And if this continues at this rate, it's expected that, RPA would achieve near universal adoption in just the next 5 years. Before we get into some of the specifics, let's talk a little bit more about some of the digital buzz that's out there, some of the digitation talk that's there. There's a couple of terms I'd like to define here to help us orient ourselves to where the opportunities associated with RPA actually exist. The first one is robotic process automation. This is really a set of technologies that we're going to talk a lot about today that mimics human action. And it mimics our actions across some software. And we'll talk about it, like I said, in great length today. But before we jump into that, let me characterize two other buzz terms that are in the market and kind of clouding where somebody may begin their journey, maybe clouding some of the opportunities or how these pieces fit together. So the first one is cognitive automation. And cognitive automation focuses on the ability to actually augment what humans would do, right? Augment by providing, some predictive decision-making experiences associated with the software. So maybe one good example that you may have come across in your time recently is maybe calling into a provider or a service or your telephone company and being introduced to a chat bot, a place where you could type in a question, maybe a commonly asked question, and the bot would recognize that question and provide some feedback or some answers, or maybe direct you in the right case. So that's an example of a cognitive automation capability. In fact, if we were to bring it home and make it a little bit closer to the healthcare space, you can imagine one cognitive capability that would use something like natural language processing to do things like read medical records and ensure that physician services were properly coded before the claim was actually submitted. So just some end of the spectrum associated with what cognitive is. And then lastly, the other term that's in the market all over the place, and often I'm in the middle of these conversations when the term automation comes up, is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is really about approximating what human intelligence is by gathering evidence and maybe managing that information into an outcome. I mean, one particular example or use case that may be familiar or sound familiar to folks in this phone is the ability to actually use AI to do things like manage bed assignments for all available patients in a hospital facility. So those are just a couple of examples, but I wanted to scope the actual conversation to focus on what today is robotic process automation. And robotic process automation, it is really defined in simple terms as a set of application technologies that automate workflows. Primarily, these are administrative work, and this RPA software can help automate large volumes of work, making the work more digital in its nature, therefore removing some of the manual aspects of it. This is an industry-level term or an industry-level statement about the context of what RPA actually is, and then where it's used and why it's used is associated with doing things like, replicating common tasks and human interactions with the technology. So it's things like, cutting and pasting or clicking buttons on a screen to perform a certain function to help people continue to move the process of what otherwise might be the second or third step in a 5-step process. If we continue forward, one of the things I'd like to do is maybe talk a little bit about, how RPA compares to maybe some of the other options that are out there in the market and that may be actual part of what is actually going to be covered. So if you take a look at the graph has two elements to it. There's the horizontal aspect, which is the speed and predictability of the execution, and the vertical is about the process disruption. And so these two variables are there to help us kind of scope. The things on the horizontal nature are really from low to high associated with, how predictable and how fast could you bring that technology to bear in your corridor or your operations. And on the vertical side, it's, if you think of your business as a collection of processes, it's how fast can you implement those processes with a level of disruption, meaning do you need to start from the beginning? Do you need to sort of refactor and digitize or re-describe your process? And so when you look at some of these traditional scenarios, there's things like BPM, which is in the middle quadrant, meaning it is not the fastest technology to adopt, but it actually also has some level of being able to drive a level of process disruption, because what you're now trying to do is redesign your processes as part of implementing a BPM style process. If you look at something like outsourcing, what you see it as kind of medium on the process disruption scale, because, well, when you outsource lots of your process implementations, you have to train and learn all of that information over and over again. So it has a burden in that sense. And if you look in the upper right-hand quadrant, where RPA ends up is, well, it ends up high in value from a standpoint of speed and predictability, and low in the sense that it's disruptive to your processes. And the reason for that is largely because RPA is something that you can layer into your infrastructure and your technology suite without a lot of disruption, meaning you can leave all of your existing systems in place, and you're going to take this technology and you're going to apply it in a way that allows your processes to continue to function, but leverage this as part of that capability. It's also known to have other capabilities built in, like the ability to run what we'll call multiple bots. A bot is merely an implementation of a single process. And it has other capabilities that allow you to do things like execute at scale, but not only execute at scale, but do it safely and securely. There's things like credential vaults that many of the RPA tools have for safely and securely storing IDs in a vault that could be used by a bot to implement a particular function. So part of getting us oriented to the automation capabilities today was to kind of compare it to other traditional forms of process transformation that folks have maybe been familiar with in recent times. Let's talk about some of the automation benefits that exist so that we can begin to kind of bring this a little bit into a little bit more clarity for ourselves. So one of the first things that I wanted to call out is there's absolutely proven decreased cycle time. And so what I mean by this is, bots are designed to perform tasks. They don't necessarily always perform the task faster than a person, but they certainly can perform the same function as a person, and they can do it reliably and consistently. Because essentially what's happening is the automation, or the bot as it's known, is clicking and using the same functions in a given software or manual process that a person would do. And if you do that over and over, there's little time for any interruption. And there's also things like being able to run 24 hours a day or 7 days a week, where today people would have, more normalized work hours that they would focus on. Along with decreased cycle time, there's certainly the ability to add flexibility and scalability into your scenarios. I talked a little bit about the scalability aspects of a single bot could be run in multiple cases. So you can create one application that performs a specific function, like maybe a claim status function that we'll look at later today, and you could run many bots on it. So you would not be limited by the fact that you created a single automation. You could add it to your suite and run it multiple times. So the fact that you're using automation to do things like create, reusable assets that have little or no learning curve is also an advantage. I've started to touch on a little bit of the bots do what they're programmed to do, or automation does what they're programmed to do. These bots, they're known to be hyper accurate, meaning they don't actually do anything that they don't actually get programmed to do. So the steps that they take are exactly the steps that you build into them. So the accuracy of what gets acted on is pretty precise. One of the interesting things as a side benefit of automation that may come to some as new information or maybe even a little bit of a surprise is this notion that, automations and bots are contributing to improved employee morale. The reason for that is because the bot itself tends to take a lot of what the routine and repetitive work is out of the hands of individual associates and workers or subject matter experts. And it provides them an opportunity to go ahead and perform other more interesting and challenging work that not only is emotionally stimulating, but in some cases, there's been solutions created where the bots are actually now controlled and managed by the associates, or what otherwise would be called as a bot operator. So putting this in the hands of those that actually execute it is something that has also been known to create improved employee morale as a side benefit of automation. And then on top of all that, there is an additional benefit that is playing out in the automation suites as they get developed, which is there is a new set of detailed data that is being captured. Because one of the things that automation and bots do is you have the ability to log and record every step that the bots take. So not only is this done in a secure fashion, but it's done in a way that allows you to create meaningful audit trails or logs. And that audit trail and those logs present significant opportunity for additional data analysis. In addition to the core benefits, let's kind of zoom out for just a moment, if we could, and talk about, what is a high level or a 100,000-foot view of an RPA or an automation implementation cycle look like? Well, what are the key tasks? What are the things you need to do as part of preparing yourself for a journey that includes developing automation and RPA? Well, here I've highlighted what I would think of as the 4 or 5 key steps in any automation initiative. The first is process identification. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, but this is essentially about, it's about identifying opportunities in your business. It's about looking at the processes that you have implemented today. And remember, these processes represent your business sort of intelligence or business institutional knowledge. But you look at those and you determine through a systematic approach which one of these would be good opportunities for us to actually implement using automation. The second sort of step in this entire life cycle is about, prioritizing what I think of as these process opportunities. So you've made a list of your process identification, your process opportunities. Now you need to have a system for prioritizing them. So how does one go about prioritizing them? Well, you put them in order based on value. And there is information that's out there that helps you sort of characterize the value in terms of speed or in terms of cost savings or in terms of productivity. And there's many systems out there that can help you determine the best way to sort of assert that prioritization. In fact, I happen to appreciate one specific type that's called weighted shortest job first. It may be familiar to those of you that are process and domain experts. After you have your processes identified, after you prioritize them, well, now it's time to, well, jump in and develop and build these bots. So you typically build these bots using these RPA tools. These RPA tools are equivalent to what technology folks would say is a 4th or 5th generation programming language. You have visual development environments where you drag and drop some commands, but these commands are essentially the same steps that others would be doing in these processes if they were developing them. And then lastly, after you've developed them, after you've prioritized them, and you've actually identified them yourself, you're going to actually go ahead and deploy them. And what that means is you're going to actually put the bot into an environment, and you're going to set a schedule, and that schedule is going to operate that bot for 24 hours a day, 10 hours a day, and you're going to begin to collect data, and you're going to track that information. And then I think around this entire life cycle, there is this notion that, you know, those that begin to engage in this type of life cycle, you're going to want to mature it, and you're going to want to mature it by putting together what I think of as a center of excellence that you use to operate and constrain the overall program to the extent that you're able to operate it at scale. That's a little bit of a zoom out for what an automation or an RPA implementation cycle might look like. Maybe now what we could do is talk a little bit more about, well, the specifics about, well, how do you identify an opportunity for automation? What does it look like? Like, what are the best processes to go ahead and try to automate? These are just a few of the high-level thoughts that you need to keep in mind as you look across your enterprise and you work on identifying those opportunities. I think the first one is there should be a high degree of human interaction. And the reason I say that is because automation tools in general are highly capable of mimicking those human interactions. Certainly the human interactions with software. That's one of the things they do best. If you were to spend time researching the topic of automation after our call today, what you would find is that that's the #1 value premise that they offer up in the total capability area. And I often think of this particular type of capability as implementing what they call swivel chair scenario. I think we're all probably familiar with the context of, well, our healthcare systems and our difficulties and challenges in interoperating with the many different systems we have. And so a swivel chair operation is something like, well, I'm trying to take information from a scheduling system and enter it into my workflow system so that I could then get an account to automatically be created. So that's taking data from one system and then putting it into another system. And automation and RPA tools, they excel at that. The second characteristic of the opportunity that would show some type of opportunity here, the characteristic that would be for identifying automation opportunities would be, it needs to be rule-based. I mean, rule-based decision logic. You should try to stay away from things that are what they think of as judgmental or judgmented-based decisions. That would be part of what you think of as knowledge work. Knowledge work meaning that, well, it's something that takes an expert. An expert needs to know a little bit about, well, the credentialing process, for example. So focus on things that are rules-based. And when I think of rules, I can tell you that there have been many projects where I've walked in and been working with a team that was trying to develop the rules. And it is not uncommon to see rules handwritten on a yellow sticky next to a monitor. There has been many times I walked in and there had been 10 stickers on the monitor. All of those are rules that allow that operator, that associate, to be able to perform functions with a high degree of precision and accuracy. So that's what I mean by rules. And those rules you can think of as a simple, if this, then do that. And the automation platforms make it easy to encode all of that capability. The next attribute is something I call structured data. And so this is about looking for situations where the data that's needed to complete a particular process is known, meaning it's very structured. There is information about NPIs, there's information about claim numbers, there's information about the status of those. There's things that can be used by the actual bots to determine outcomes. What you want to stay clear of in the early automation or RPA scenarios is unstructured data. And that's just because unstructured data well, it adds complexity to the solution. So if you have a text field that people can type any comment they want in it, that would be difficult to use that text field in your solution. If that text field can only be answered with a yes, no, or not applicable, well, that's structured data, and it's a lot more straightforward to implement something that falls into that category. Next, and finally, what's on my short list of things to consider when I'm looking for automation opportunities is this notion of high volume or repetition. And that's because, bots, once you encode them, they can operate at scale. And this whole notion of a repeatability factor, it will drive value in the types of outcomes that you create with your automation. So those are some of the solutions that are available to consider as part of identifying opportunities for automation. So we talked a bit about the industry, the context of the healthcare space. We've talked about defining some of the definitions associated with RPA now. I'd like to start to sort of zoom in a little bit more and make the second half of our conversation about the healthcare space and automation specifics around the healthcare space. When I think of the perfect storm comment at the beginning associated with increasing costs and complexity, there's a set of what I would say is well-known value drivers associated with the benefits of automating in the healthcare space. And there's a lot that's been written about this, but I like to think of things in very simple terms associated with what are my pain points? What's my proposed solution? And am I going to get the benefits from that solution, and what are those specific benefits? So when I assess kind of our healthcare space with a sense of automation and purpose, what I'm led to believe and what I think is there is a lot of labor-intensive processes that are happening. There's a lot of swivel chair operations, as I mentioned. There's a lot of collecting information. It can be burdensome to manage. And that entire sort of cash to collection journey that's associated with revenue cycle management is no exception. In fact, there's lots of things that complicate that, and we're going to talk more about that in just another slide or two. But in addition to that labor and that burdensome, collection of that data, there's things like, well, there's fragmented and disconnected technology infrastructure. We've been talking about that. That's not, the healthcare system is not known for being on the edge of technology. There are some lagging technology terms, and there are some systems that aren't just made for integration and interoperability. And then there's all sorts of complexities that are associated with that integration step and integrating those requirements with things like payers. And so the automation itself, it helps cut through those pain circumstances, those pain points, by doing things like, lessening the burden of the labor-intensive processes. As we've already talked about, it minimizes and marginalizes that repetitiveness. And it enables workforce and folks to aim at higher value opportunities in the organization as part of doing that. The other thing it does, which I think cannot be minimized, is it ensures that your execution of your processes, it's like standardized. As soon as you encode it in an automation solution, it is standardized. There is almost no variation in it, which is very different than if you have a manual and that you have 50 associates that either read that manual, and then you have to practice getting them all to perform that function the same way. And then I think we've talked a little bit about being able to digitally monitor and collect information about what's going on in the automation itself with auditing and logging and new information that you can collect that says, oh, I see that when I perform my claim status this way or my credentialing that way, that these implications happen to bubble to the top. And there are some well-documented benefits that are appearing in lots of healthcare providers and healthcare systems that are associated with issues ranging from increased capacity, anywhere from 30 or 35% all the way up to 200. And there's a lot of business cases that you could read, or case studies that have validated that information in there. And we've talked about this freeing up of the staff to focus on higher order problem solving or more knowledge work. I mean, I often think of it as, well, bots work, people think. And there is clearly advantages to both speed, quality, and consistency of work as I was describing. So as we now kind of zoom in even deeper to start talking about some of the potential use cases in the revenue cycle scenarios, let me just tell you one way that I've been thinking about it, and I'm going to go a little deeper on a couple of these topics or process opportunities today. But for me, when I was laying out the conversation and thinking about how I would want to communicate it out, I think it's a fairly well-known set of processes that exist at a very high level in the revenue cycle space. I mean, there is a front-end set of processes associated with things like patient access, and this is the ability to schedule an appointment. Do your pre-registration associated with that. Find out your financial clearance and counseling operations and opportunities associated with getting that. Then you check in, then you arrive. And then there's a set of sort of what I think of as the middle process pieces that are associated with doing things like the physicians have performed their services, so now you need to sort of collect those services and make sure that they're implemented in a way that is consistent with the medical coding standards of IDC-9 and IDC-10 and so on and so forth. And then there's a set of back-end processes that do things like focus on claims and the reimbursement part and the billing follow-up and things like why claims get denied or customer support associated with maybe assisting somebody with their own patient responsibilities as part of the total services that have been rendered on their behalf. And so I had those broken down by the top, dozen or so processes that I would expect most people with healthcare experience and specifically revenue cycle experience to recognize. If I go a little bit deeper, I have a couple of examples today that I'd like to focus on, and I'll talk about them in terms of, what's the pain point, what's the solution, and then what would the key benefits be. And so the ones I've highlighted for us today is I picked one on the front, which is specifically associated with that pre-registration of an account. And then two on the back that had to do with, I think what I call billing edits and claim status. And so billing edits is about being able to figure out where there are issues associated with the bill and correct them and make sure that the bill gets sent out to the right payers and that those accounts are appropriately balanced. And then claim status is something that checks on the status of the claim that allows us to be able to see that the claim is moving through the life cycle of a claim. So if we go a little bit further, let me go ahead and start delving into our very first example here. So this is billing edit. And so let me just start by saying, for me, what I like to do is think, like I said, in terms of not only pain point solutions and benefits, but in addition to that, I do like to make sure that I have something visually that's available for me to be able to actually discern how the process works. What are the steps? Who needs to do what? And so I presented what I think of as a pretty basic layout of what I think of as a billing edit scenario. And when I think of a billing edit scenario, it's essentially there's a bill, it's getting ready to be submitted to a payer or an insurance company so that they can act on it on behalf of their clients or their insured person. And as part of doing that, you have something like a billing scrubber that will look at the claim and report if there's errors on that claim. And if there are, they'll give you, a list of one or a dozen different types of errors. And then what will happen is you'll need to be able to, resolve those errors. And those errors range from things like, is this the first time the claim has been sent, or is this a rebill because there's been partial payment? Or is there information that's missing from a guarantor or an insuree standpoint? So all of those things can get called out. But in the end, the overall solution, or the pain point, I should say, that I start with is there's just a lot of manual touches, and it's very repetitive. And so it jumps to the top of my list as potentially an opportunity for us to actually look at this as an automation scenario, one where you can actually perform the actual repair on the claim and then have it sent along to the electronic billing process. And so the solution we have here is, we have the ability to actually look at a claim, find out what's wrong with the claim, classify that claim error by a specific category, and then have the automation actually repair that. In fact, one of the things I'd like to do is run a video that will take just a moment for us to show this, but I'd like to show this one in action so that what we could do is actually visualize it a little bit. So let me just click forward, and let us run this automation. So this particular automation, and I'll just give you a little bit of background, is all about billing edits. It's about taking a bot. It's about making sure you select the actual claim that's associated with it. It runs it through what's known as a billing or claim scrubber. It finds errors. It classifies the errors, and then it acts on it. So here's a little bit about what we're going to see in just this very short video. We're going to see the ability to identify a claim defect. We're going to be able to look at that claim defect, determine the next steps on that claim defect, and certainly provide the missing information by looking at other similar claims in the system. So here's the very first step. We're working on it, and we find that we log into the actual billing scrubber. These are often tools that are out there. There's a number of different versions of them and opportunities, but it's known for finding them. What you're looking at is the actual automation going through that, collecting errors. And how does it collect the errors? When it's putting in the actual claim number into the system is highlighting the errors, right? Because that's what the claim editor or claim scrubber actually does. As part of collecting that information, the bot is making a list of those functions, and then what it does is it looks up similar accounts that have been missing that same or similar information, and what it will do is take the opportunity to look at more information coming from the remit and that other electronic information that's in other systems in the enterprise, connect it up with this solution, and then resolve those errors. And it's really that simple. And so that is a running example. I thought it was important to maybe show just a little bit about what the visualization of a automation script would look like. That automation script is one that is, I think, running today in a number of different places. And it is one that I think is pretty consistent with the types of things you could do in many different systems. Let's talk a little bit about another example here. This example is about the pre-registration scenario. And this one is interesting and also, I think, opportunistic because it does, as I was mentioning earlier, which is it performs that swivel chair operation, which is taking information from one system and making it available in another. Because, in some cases, the healthcare systems and tools are not known for their interoperability. So this is a scenario where there's no integration between these systems. And so what operators or associates might do is they might log into one system, collect information that describes when a patient is actually scheduled to appear, send them information about pre-registration forms, but then they have to go ahead and create that account so that when the person shows up, they have the beginnings of the information to go ahead and create the delivery of that actual claim information so that a bill can be sent. So because there's lack of integration between the systems, and there's a lot of repetitiveness associated with cutting and copying and pasting information from one system to another, the solution is, or automation opportunity, is well positioned to act on that. And so here, there's some benefits that are associated with, the automation capability, not only performing the swivel chair function, meaning adding system information from one system, meaning the scheduling solution, and making it available in the host system that would be the place where all the patient record information is kept. But what it actually does, in addition to doing that swivel chair operation, meaning moving it from one system to another, it acts as an integration layer. So where there was no integration capability when you started, you've now created and facilitated an actual integration opportunity and an integration capability. Maybe one more familiar one, and then we'll keep going. This one's related to claim status. And this one is all about sort of obtaining the status of a claim based on a payer website. So many of you that are familiar with claim status in the healthcare space may know that payers essentially provide websites, and these websites actually allow you to type in the name of a particular claim or a number of a claim and look up the specific status, and the status can be it's pending, or it's been paid, or it's blocked, or it has a defect. And so this can be a very time-consuming process, and it is, well, not the most interesting one for associates or operators to perform. This is the ability to sort of collect in a proactive fashion those errors and fix them up front. And so this particular automation scenario includes actually being able to take a list of claims from one of your systems, review those accounts for any issues, put those out into a list, feed them in the form of the list to the bot, have the bot connect to the website, and actually have the bot navigate the website. And, one of the things that, you may not realize in terms of just a simple solution like claim status is, well, these payer websites, they all have different UIs. So your associates, your burden is actually to master many of these different websites. If you were to train a bot and use a bot to deliver it, you would actually have a reusable asset and a much lower training level associated with that. You would need to have fewer people to be able to perform that function, and maybe more people you could apply to other more difficult and challenging work associated with that. So those are a couple of examples that I think will be in the materials. They have, like I said, a workflow or a graphic that describes the specific workflow and circumstances associated with the actual work that the bot would need to achieve. If I begin to sort of wrap up our conversation here and want to make sure there's a couple of other items I hit here, let me just touch a little bit on this notion of, what does automation really do, and what are the facts versus what are the myths? And there's lots that's been written about this, and lots that's been said about this, but let me just start with this first one that often people ask about, which is a bot's going to replace humans. And I don't think the RPA or the automation was even intended to do that. So the short answer to that is no. It's meant to sort of complement how humans work. It's meant to give you a digital capability that maybe you didn't have before you perform the automation. It's again meant to sort of facilitate the bot's work people think scenarios. And so you can imagine, maybe just to give a gross level analogy, 50 years ago, carpenters were building homes with hand saws. Right, and they had to cut the wood with, lots of precision, and some were better than others. But all of a sudden, they created electric saws and miter saws and precision saws. And did you still need the carpenters? Of course you did. But did the tool make the carpenters better? Yeah, it made them more productive. It made them better. It made them more capable of creating sort of more precise sort of angles. Even. So that's the same analogy I think of when I think of bots. It's about putting tools in the hands of operators and SMEs so that they can take advantage of that. So the next one is implementing a bot. Will it improve productivity, and how will it do that? I would say that the answer to this is well, yes, it will boost on productivity, and boosting productivity is certainly a complicated and difficult challenge to do in any context. But if you can actually codify, as I think of it, a particular process and enable it to through a bot, you're not only going to have a standard operating procedure, you're going to have one that operates with a lot of precision and a lot of scale. There has been a lot of information, and I think I mentioned one of the reports earlier that was published by a Deloitte scenario that had to do with the percentage of people now paying attention to automation was 53% better than half the people, with that increasing to 72%. One of the things I also noted in there that I found interesting is that those same people, the leaders in those organizations, are reporting payback on their investments associated with automation in less than 12 months. And in addition to that payback recovery, they're talking about improved performance. In that particular report, they were in that 25% range. There's many others that talk about more, given the circumstances associated with it, but you can certainly expect that to be part of it. So productivity gains, yes. Then the third one I have here is, well, can we deploy, a first bot quickly? You can. I think it's important to do pilots, but I think in addition to doing pilots, what you really need to do is be prepared to scale. I think if you believe the earlier slide associated with, a 100,000-foot view of the overall cycle, which consisted of identifying the opportunity, prioritizing the opportunity, implementing it, that is a notion of scale in there. There is certainly a opportunity to do a pilot and bring some proof of concept together really quickly to enable your organization to learn from that. What I what I think is well known in the context of migrating to any or implementing any technology scenario these days is to focus on a little bit on that fail fast and agile approach. So you can certainly apply that with bots, and it's pretty effective at operating with those principles. The next one is, well, we need to transform our processes before we add RPA to our environment. I would say maybe. I guess here I have the answer as ideally yes, because yes, you would want to have all your processes, formally documented, refactored, and enabled, and highly precise and standardized. But sometimes there isn't time for that, and sometimes it's okay to encode a process in an automation solution, knowing that it's not perfect, but it certainly does the function, and it has the value that it needs in order to do that. And then the last myth that I'll call out here is this whole notion of, well, we need to build a lot of bots, right? As many bots as we could possibly build. For me, it's not about being mesmerized by the volume or the number of bots you build. A much better way to approach this would be to focus on the meaningful work that the bots need to achieve, meaning the process itself. Think of it in terms of not bots, but transactions. Transactions in the sense of like, well, how many billing edits can I create or execute in a day using bots? How many claims status could I achieve in a single day? Or how many physicians can I get credentialed in my new system in a single day? Those are much more meaningful measures versus the number of a bot. So that's a little bit about the myths and the facts associated with automation. Maybe this one last chart before we get ready to wrap up here is this notion of like, current state and future state. In this current state, future state scenario to me was like, if I think of everything we were talking about today, and I put it in sort of simple terms around, where are we with today and what could automation help us be? This is the type of thought process I go through on my own. First of all, it's about moving from these manual and error-prone scenarios associated with performing tasks that are repetitive, tasks that can be achieved in other ways, right? Tasks that are not the most they're not the most high-value scenarios, but they're required in order to operate your business. Being able to encode those in a bot affords you a net new capability that your organization doesn't have today. So either whether we're talking about the error-prone aspects of it, the repetitive nature of it, or the added scale of it, they all have the same sort of outcome. You move from these error-prone, repetitive scenarios in these scenarios where you're limited by the number of FTEs or operators or SMEs that you can put on some of this redundant work to, well, a more foolproof, because the bot is going to do it consistently and it's going to do it at scale, to these, solving larger problems because you can move people to, well, higher value work associated with, knowledge work and knowledge thinkers. Instead of having to always hire people to perform the function, you can have automations augment the people that you do hire so that you can focus them on things that are going to be more challenging, more meaningful work for them, and also more meaningful work for you as a business from an overall standpoint. And that enables you to do things like, well, even automate things like, low balances scenarios that today you might not get to because, well, they're highly labor intensive. To maybe now you can actually, with some digital workforce capabilities, be able to make a dent in some of those scenarios. So it's a little bit of it's a shift of a operating model to a scenario where you're able to add a set of digital workers that can be a component of your overall space and solution from an enterprise standpoint. So things to consider, how do I get started? What do I need to do? Why do I need to do it? How do I go about doing it? And who do I do it with? And, and when? And so these are some of the questions that for each person in each enterprise beginning their journey, they need to contemplate and think about it. This is, from a what standpoint, it's about assessing the opportunities themselves. We talked about this today. We talked about, which processes are good candidates for automation. why they're a good candidate for automation, and maybe even how to do a pilot with some of those things. There is certainly the why component. We talked about this with the process prioritization notion, and like, how to build your business case, why one automation is more important than another, what the benefits specifically would be, not in terms of bots, right, or automation in general, but in terms of transactions that the team could actually capture and complete using these digital capabilities. We talked about, also an important part of the why, about being able to capture data and measures that the automation reports and collects today. It could be net new functions that you may not be doing today. And then the how part of it is determining that operating model, meaning, where is the best place for your organization to excel at the business model that you need to achieve and you need to support. And then, who and how will those bots and automations be managed are an important aspect of this. So there's a model that's in the marketplace today that says, for most people, there are scenarios, and most enterprises, there are scenarios about the bots collecting data, projecting that data into a dashboard. That dashboard can show you where topics are being met and transactions and KPIs are being achieved and where they're not. But in addition to that, they typically have created positions referred to as bot operators. And these are SMEs or former associates that have taken up the responsibility to manage these bots by scheduling them and running them. And, maybe if there's an outage and a system has to be taken down, taking them down and restarting them. So some basic care and maintenance or feeding of the automation systems and capabilities are great. And then on the who part, there are some pretty skilled partners that are in the field, and the RPA space and automation is maturing really fast. You won't have any trouble finding those that are performing well in the space. And then the last part is like the when. It's like, how did you go about the planning, and should you do a pilot? And you should always pilot technology before you go ahead and do it. And then, thinking through that strategy associated with how do you do it at scale. That was the part about the automation lifecycle in the COE context that I mentioned earlier in our conversation today. But all of those plan elements of an automation roadmap is another important aspect of considering how you could get yourselves started in this space. So as we begin to wrap up, because I do want to see if we have time for just a couple of questions, I want to say thank you again for your time today. I really appreciate it. What I like to say is, on behalf of R1, we appreciate your time. We know that it's busy. We're going to take just a couple questions here as well. But in terms of our business, automation is a really important element of it. We have a fairly significant and sophisticated capability that we are building. Our business is in the net patient revenue range of under management of $30+ billion and 60 million encounters a year. We're a global operation in the sense that we operate primarily in the U.S., but we have teams elsewhere, but 17,000 people. We support 25,000+ physicians, and we today have some 2.7 million transactions that we're performing with our digital workforce. So I wanted to say, like I said, thank you again for your time today. I think, operator, we have time for just a couple questions here if we'd like, and I will turn it back to you, Laura, for your assistance with the questions.
Thank you, David, for that fantastic presentation. We will now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. We do have a great question here from our attendees. And to start off with, David, the question is, what software or tools are needed to create bots? Is it based on screen sharing technology or on a client that is running on top of the EMR or practice management applications?
That's a great question. So the basic tools are called RPA tools or automation tools. Some of the more notable ones that are in the market happen to be one called UiPath, one called Automation Anywhere, and Blue Prism are some of the more commonly noted ones. All of those operations and tools have the ability to capture screens and feed keystrokes into any system that you're trying to operate or automate with. And so you essentially use those tools to catch up. If you have an EMR that you access, those tools can be used to connect to those EMR solutions, and you can use those to do things like interop with those applications, even over environments such as Citrix.
Fantastic, and thank you so much for that informative response. We have another audience question here. The question is, we started meeting almost weekly to discuss RPA. Other than the examples you discussed, where are some of the other areas automation can be used in revenue cycle or financial operations at a hospital?
So that's a great question, and so let me give a couple of examples that I think are clear to me. So we talked about one associated with managing equipment on the floor and bedding. I mean, there's a lot of, say, scheduling systems and activities that are associated with being able to make room equipment available for patients that are in hospital. So that's one area. You can certainly automate things like the scheduling and patient registration aspects of it. And there is certainly other aspects of being able to automate things like the billing and follow-up pieces that are part of that entire hospital care experience that is needed.
And that's a great point. Thank you for clarifying that. And we have time for one more question. The final question we have here is, what about scaling? Once we're past the pilot stage, how can we easily scale this?
Great question. So scaling, it's one of the things that I think we all think about. It's probably for most of us a thought that says, oh, we can do this once, but can we do it many times? And as part of getting value, you certainly need to be able to do it many times. So I think I talked about this during the conversation today, which is when you code this up in terms of automation, one of the things you end up with is a script. That script is now a reusable asset. So if that script was about checking claim status, like we talked about earlier, or editing a claim defect, you can now take that one script, and instead of having one automation run it, you can have it run on 50 bots or 30 bots. And the way you do that is you do need to have some infrastructure support to do it. The platforms that are available today for automation typically all run in high availability mode, but you do it by essentially taking that asset that you recoded, which is now reusable, and you actually deploy it over and over again, and you deploy it throughout your enterprise.
That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank David for his excellent presentation and R1 RCM for sponsoring today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.